but without 60 hours or more, I feel bored. So when I'm laying next to you at night, I'm dreaming. When I turn out the lights, dreaming. I'm not having to struggle and being with you, girl. I don't want to work another double. 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 I'm trying to make it work a day and night, but without enough time, it's too tight for the lights and the electric bill. Not to mention the phone, so I'll be a little late getting home. I gotta work another double. I don't wanna work another double. I don't wanna work another double. I'm tired of slaving. I don't wanna work another double. I don't wanna work another double. I don't wanna work another double.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Roxy from the Bank of Prairie du Sac, and I want to, on behalf of the bank, thank you all for being here. I know we have quite a few people that are tuning in virtually, so we're happy to be able to offer this in person this year as well as virtually. And again, this year we have Dr. Stephen Deller here. Dr. Deller is a professor of agriculture and applied economics at University of Wisconsin-Madison and also interim director of University of Wisconsin Extension. So we'll start off today with Dr. Deller. We'll have time for questions. Tawana is going to be here with a microphone, so if you have a question, leave it up to Dr. Deller if he wants to wait until the presentation's over for questions. And then Tawana will be happy to bring the microphone so that everybody that's watching virtually will be able to hear the questions as well. Okay? So please welcome Dr. Stephen Deller.
Does this thing work? Good. I'll just hand this. Good morning. I have to say that every year I can always predict that we're going to have cold weather. What was it yesterday? It was in the mid-30s yesterday, and it's 11 degrees this morning. So I appreciate, oops. Let's go back to that. I'm going to talk about three things this morning. First of all is COVID. The COVID's the thing that just simply won't go away. And it's created a bit of a roller coaster in the economy. The second thing is that what do we think the near-term future of the economy is going to look like? I used this slide last time we talked. If you heard about the economists with the dartboard, and it's the same thing today. With COVID, there is so much uncertainty going on that it's really kind of an educated guess in terms of what's going to be happening with the future. I think we're going to do something a little bit differently, is kind of talk a little bit about economic development strategies and how we can kind of stop and reflect on how we're trying to influence the local and regional economy and the way that we kind of think about it. And particularly, are we in a fourth wave? The first thing that is kind of the elephant in the room is COVID. And we had a year ago, we had the spike that was really kind of uncomfortable. And then we kind of went into a lull, and things kind of got back to normal a little bit over the summertime. But then we've had the most current one that's come around. And it's really kind of creating a tremendous amount of angst as far as the economy is concerned. We're not quite sure why this is occurring. Well, actually, it has to do with vaccination rates and people trying to get back to some degree of normality. Okay, like having the meeting today. Last year, it was completely remote. We're trying to get back to normal a little bit, you know, knowing things like wearing a mask and social distancing and things like that. So we're trying to. But what really drives people's behavior is the death rate, okay? The infection rate, you get it, you don't feel good, it's like a bad flu. But what really drives people's behavior is what's happening with the death rate. And we can see here that the death rate is spiking back up. Now, a lot of this death rate is occurring with people that are not vaccinated, okay? So if you're vaccinated and you're boosted and you're practicing kind of what they're recommending, if you get COVID, you probably just get really sick. My daughter had it. And it's like a really bad cold with a really bad headache. She's vaccinated and boosted, and that seems to be what's happening here. It's really the unvaccinated folks that are kind of driving a lot of this. But the behavior, though, is that people are still kind of hesitant. They're hesitant because of that behavior. But if you look at the unemployment, this is the current unemployment claims. This is the number of folks that are actually filing for unemployment. You can see that, you can see the spike when COVID first hit, and then the rate of applications for new unemployment has really gone down dramatically. It's back to where it was pre-COVID, okay? So the number of jobs that are being, you know, the number of people that are being laid off and applying for unemployment is really back to kind of where it is in a normal situation. Indeed, you could almost say that we're kind of in a very, very tight labor market right now. And this is something that Matt's going to be talking about after I'm done, okay? Now, this is what's happening to employment by wage categories, okay? There's a timer on this thing. I wish I'd turn the timer off. There's three types of jobs here that this is looking at. And this is, again, looking at right before COVID, January of 2020, COVID hits, and then we kind of rebound and we come back a little bit. Notice that high wage jobs, we're back up above where we were. We're doing very well in terms of high wage jobs. We're doing okay in terms of middle wage jobs. The problem is these low wage jobs, okay? We're losing low wage jobs. Now, why is that? Is that because these jobs are not coming back? Or is it because people simply don't want these jobs anymore? Okay? I think that a lot of the labor shortage that we've been looking at is actually in these low wage jobs. People are deciding they don't want to put up with it, okay? There's other opportunities for a lot of lower wage workers, okay? A lot of these lower wage jobs are where you're face to face with people, and people don't feel comfortable with that. One of the things that's coming out of this labor market situation that is really kind of, when you stop and think about it, it kind of makes sense, is that there's a lot of mental health issues that are coming out of this. A lot of the remote working, some people love it, some people really struggle with it. The whole situation that we've been experiencing the past 2 years has really created a lot of mental health issues. And is that playing out in these low wage jobs, okay? So I think that this is something that we may want to think about in terms of how we proceed and how we move forward coming out, okay? This is essentially looking at consumer spending, all consumer spending. And you can actually see that we're back up above where we were, okay? There was a real downtick in that first half year when COVID first hit, people were not spending money. They were not going out. They were not buying things. Okay, there's a lot of pent-up demand because of that. And so people are trying to get back out. They're trying to get back to normal. And they're doing that through spending. So our spending levels from a consumer demand side is actually doing pretty well. Okay? Restaurants and lodging and hotel spending, which is actually for Sauk County kind of a big deal. You can actually see that that's gone back up. People are going out to eat more often. They're trying to get back to normal. They're doing more carry-out. A lot of restaurants have adapted and adjusted to that. So we're seeing that. Hotel spending. We're seeing hotels starting to pick back up. Okay, people are trying to travel. They're trying to return to normal a little bit. And we're seeing that in a lot of the spending. Now the problem that we've got though is, what's the next one? The problem that we've got is in these supply chains. Okay, people want to spend money. The problem though is that the things that they want to spend their money on is not available. Okay, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. This is time spent outside the home. Okay, this is, you see the big drop off. People basically stopped going out. They stayed at home. Okay, you saw somewhat of a return, not back up to where we were, particularly in summertime. You would think in summertime people would be out and about. They weren't. Winter came back in, we came back down again, but notice that this is reference to January of 2020. So part of that drop down is partially a reflection of, well, it's wintertime, we don't go out. Part of it's also, that's when we had that second spike. Okay, people were not going out. We see a return, kind of summertime, but again, we're not back up to where we were. And then you see the drop down, again, wintertime, but people are, part of this is, I want to go out to eat, but I'm not going to go sit down. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go get it, I'm going to pick it up, and I'm going to take it home. Okay, that's part of it. The other part of it is remote working. We're seeing, this is the amount of time spent away from work, or time spent at work, the workplace. You can see some spikes down. Those are actually, those drops down, those are holidays. Okay, those are basically Christmas, New Year's Eve, weekends, things like that. Okay, but the problem here is that look at that 18%. We're down 18%. What we're seeing is a real tremendous increase in the amount of telecommuting. Okay, how many of you can actually work from home? How many of you are deciding that that's okay, I like this? How many of you are saying, I'm going to continue to telecommute? A lot of employers are having a difficult time. I wish I had that timing turned off. Could you do that, Ron? Thank you. This is something that a lot of employers are really, really struggling with, is how do we adapt to this? How do we adapt to this kind of remote working environment now? I was talking to a woman from Kures that was actually up at the Sauk County Leadership Program about a week ago. And it was an executive with Kures, which is the Credit Union National Association, which is down in Madison. Okay? They've gone remote working, and they love it. Okay? They're thinking they just put a major investment in their campus there, and they're thinking, we just made this major investment, and we're probably not going to use a lot of it because so many of our workers are telecommuting now. They're finding that worker productivity has actually gone up, and they're finding that their labor pool has actually increased. They're hiring people in Florida now who can telecommute in. Okay? They like it. On the other hand, Epic down in Verona is having a really difficult time. They want their workers back on the campus. The attitude is that we invested millions and millions of dollars in this campus. We want our workers here. Well, a lot of the workers are going, nope. So there's a real struggle here with how employers are going to handle this and work with this. Okay, now this telecommuting, I think it's creating an opportunity for a lot of high amenity rural areas. Okay, someplace like Sauk Prairie. Why? You're close enough to Madison that you have the urban amenities. Okay, you can go to the theater, you can go to a concert, there's things to do in Madison, but yet you have kind of the small town, high amenity quality of life of a place like Sauk Prairie. Okay, this creates a real opportunity for people that may want to, are thinking, you know, I'm going to continue to telecommute, and I want a different kind of lifestyle. That creates a real opportunity here. But what's the key? How is that going to, what's the linchpin for that to work? Broadband, okay? And it used to be, broadband was defined as 25.3, 25 down the speed at which you can download and upload, 25.3, okay? How sufficient is that? Matt and I have conversations all the time. For my wife and I, we're empty nesters. We both kind of remote work. 25.3 is fine. You've got two kids that are trying to remote learn. You're remote working, and your wife is remote working. Is 25.3 enough? Not enough. Okay? Now they're saying that you need to have, what, 55 as a minimum?
I'm saying 100 up, 100 down, symmetrical.
Which is, so it seems as though as soon as you get broadband in there, guess what? You got it? Now it's not enough. Okay? So it's a real challenge. The other issue is housing affordability. Okay? Now this is relative. Because of your proximity to Madison, you're a housing market that you're looking at. You're looking at a very tight labor housing market right now. I know that the community is struggling with housing issues. Okay? Quality housing, affordable housing, starter home housing, quality of the housing stock. Okay? But when you look at housing here, and you compare it to housing prices in Madison, it's a bargain, okay? But that still doesn't help the supply issue. So you got broadband issues and you've got housing issues to kind of think about, okay? Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on what's happening in the Sauk County economy because Matt's going to be doing that. But what we've got here is just what's happening in the population growth all the way back to 1969. You can see that through the 1990s and the 2000s, population growth in Sauk County was actually pretty strong. And then the Great Recession hit. And the population growth rate since the Great Recession has not returned to prior levels. Okay? Population is not growing in Sauk County nearly as fast as perhaps it could be. The question is why? Why would that be? Notice that Wisconsin, though, has always had slower population growth than the rest of the U.S. Okay, if you look at employment growth, that really jumps out. You can see strong employment growth for Sauk County, and then the Great Recession hit, and it just flattens. Now, this we've talked about before, but what's new here is look at the very last year, 2020. That's COVID. COVID really hit employment in Sauk County at a higher rate or a greater magnitude than either the U.S. or Wisconsin. Now, why might that be? Is it because the Wisconsin Dells? Did the Wisconsin Dells basically shut down and lose a lot of the employment there? That's a question. Okay? But there's something about Sauk County that got hit really particularly hard because of COVID. Now the question is, why is that? Okay, now what about income? This is Sauk County compared to the US, that's the blue dash line. And Sauk County compared to Wisconsin, that's the green line. And then you also got Wisconsin compared to the US. If the line is above 100, that means the per capita income in the county is actually higher than the national average. Throughout the entire time period here, notice other than 2 years, 1969 and 2019, Sauk County's per capita income has historically been below Wisconsin and below the US average, okay? Notice that the Great Recession, that period right there in 2007, there's a big drop off there, a little bit of a recovery, but notice again that COVID kind of hit. This is a new set of data that's become available, gross state product, gross domestic product. This is kind of the granddaddy measure of the economic economy. This is the data that we look at to determine whether or not the nation is in a recession or a growth period. You can see the Great Recession, got slowed down, slow recovery, very slow recovery, and then notice what happened with COVID in 2020, a real hit. Sauk County was really hit particularly hard by the COVID pandemic. Now the question is, why is that? I'm speculating that a lot of it has to do with tourism. There was a real shift in how consumers were spending their money when it comes to tourism. Rather than going to places like the Wisconsin Dells, what they were going is to places like Devil's Lake. The problem, though, with that kind of a shift is, think about it. If you go to the Dells, what do you do with your wallet? You got it out a lot more. They're spending a lot more money. When you go to Devil's Lake, how much money are you spending? Not a whole lot. Okay, so I think that kind of shift in spending is being picked up there. Okay, housing prices. Okay, this is the housing index for housing price index. You can see the bubble that led to the Great Recession, the bubble popping. You can see a strong recovery there in housing prices. But look at what's happened in 2021. The data for Sauk County is not available yet, but what's happened to housing prices? There's been a huge spike in housing prices, okay? And you really see this in Madison. My wife and I have a rental property, had a rental property, and we sold it. And we got $100,000 more for that rental house than if we had sold it 3 years ago. The housing market in Madison, particularly for starter homes, has just exploded. And this spike that's occurring right there, my wife and I are walking away looking good. We like that. What about the poor guy that bought the house? He ended up paying a premium because of that spike in housing prices. Now, if you're looking at trying to attract people to move into the area because of increase in telecommuting, proximity to Madison, and the amenities and quality of life that's here, but you've got a housing spike that's occurring like that, that's a real roadblock to that particular economic development strategy. That's okay. Thank you. Okay, now the second part of what I want to talk about today. This is what's the future of the economy look like? Again, if you've been here before, last year, the year before, and the year before that, what I do is I look at the Wall Street Journal. What they do, the Wall Street Journal does every month, is they survey about 60 or so different organizations and individuals who do economic forecasting. And they essentially ask them a series of questions in terms of what do they think the future of the economy is going to be doing. And there are two things that are driving out here. Omicron and inflation drive down U.S. growth outlook. Okay? Why would inflation be driving down the future outlook of the economy? Inflation in and of itself, I mean, it eats away at your spending dollars, but inflation in and of itself isn't that bad. It's the policy response to try to get inflation down. That's what we want to look at. Okay? So, the forecast for what do we think the gross domestic product, the GDP, again, that's our granddaddy measure of economic activity. What do we think it's going to be doing over the next 4 quarters? Okay? We can see that the quarter of the current quarter that we're in right now, we're expecting about a 3%. That's the average. And what I did here again is I took an average and then I computed the standard deviation across the 60 or so estimates, and then kind of gave you a high end and a low end. So somewhere between 2% and 4%. That's a pretty big band. Okay, we think the growth rate might tick up a little bit in the second quarter, but yet it's going to be coming downward. If we forecast this out, Oh, the other thing here that's really kind of odd is that notice the height of that bar is bigger closer in. As we go farther out, that bar gets shorter and shorter. Now that's really odd because generally, the shorter term, what we think is going to occur in this next quarter and the next quarter, we can generally zero in on that pretty well. And so as you move out into the future, we get more uncertainty, more risk, okay? So we would think that that bar in the short term would be kind of tight. And as we move out in the future, it gets bigger. That's not what's happening here. So there's a lot of uncertainty. I'm interpreting this as essentially saying there's a lot of stuff that's going on that we don't really understand. A lot of it has to do with COVID, okay? And we're hoping that COVID eventually goes away. If COVID goes away, then our confidence in what's going to happen to the economy becomes much greater. Okay, this is the annual forecast. This is the full year for this current year. Then what do we think is going to happen next year and then in 2024? Okay? Again, notice that kind of larger confidence interval, if you will. It's not a confidence interval, but you can think of it that way. It's pretty tall, pretty big for 2022, and it gets tighter or smaller as we go into the future. That's really odd, okay? But again, I think what that is that that's COVID. COVID is the wild card, okay? We don't know how COVID is still continuing to ripple through the economy. There will be another variant of COVID. Will it be like a cold, or will it be a deadly variant? We don't know, okay? And what the economists are predicting here is that some are pretty optimistic and some are not optimistic, okay? But as the likelihood of COVID going away increases, our confidence in what we think the economy is going to do increases. Okay, now, inflation. It used to be COVID was the 300 or 800-pound gorilla in the room, but now we got this thing called inflation, okay? It's the other 800-pound elephant in the room. There's two price indices that are here. One is the consumer price index, which is the blue line, okay? This is going back to 2000, it's monthly, and you can see what's happening to the consumer price index. Those are the prices that you and I as consumers face. When we go to the grocery store, when we go to the hardware store, those are the prices that we tend to be looking at, okay? The producer price index, which is the red line, is the prices that producers are looking at when they're buying inputs into their production processes, okay? You notice that the producer price index tends to be a lot more unstable, okay? But what's really got a lot of concern going on here is what's happening in the most recent time period. Notice that the consumer price index is kicking up, okay? I also notice that the producer price index is kicking up. Going back historically, we have not seen inflation rates like this for a long, long, long time, okay? Now, how many of you don't need to raise your hand, old enough to remember the Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan political debates and what was happening to the economy then, okay? Those of us that are old enough to remember that time period, the current inflation rate is like, who cares, right? Because we had double-digit inflation rates back then, okay? This is like, oh man, what a pain, but it's not unusual. We're the old people. There are a lot of folks out there that have never experienced inflation rates like this, okay? And because they've never experienced it before, they have nothing to relate it to, okay? Now, this is the percent change from one period to the next, and this is monthly data. The reason I put this up here is to kind of show you that the producer price index is really a lot more unstable than the consumer price index. So that's, the prices that businesses are looking at are a lot more, jumping around a lot more. But notice that, and this is where this monthly data, a lot of folks are looking at this most current data, where you see that little downtick there. A lot of people are saying, "Oh, well, maybe this is, inflation is going to start going away." Well, this is people that. How many of you watch the stock market every day? Do you go crazy, thinking, "Oh my God, the stock market's up today, yay! Oh God, the stock market's down today, boo!" Right? You want to look over the long term. You want to look over at least 3 periods to see if there's a trend that's occurring here. Okay? I don't see a trend there. Notice that the producer price index from about most of 2020, 2021, it's above 1. That inflation is going up, but it drops down. If the next period it's down again, and the period after that it's down again, that's 3 periods in a row that it's down, then you can maybe say that that upward pressure on prices is actually starting to alleviate it. It's starting to back off a little bit. Okay, so what do we think is going to happen to inflation rates? This is monthly forecast going out to December 2024. Notice how the confidence, that kind of the height of the bar there in June of 2022 is kind of small. And as you go farther into the future, it gets wider. That's more typical. Okay? Because as you go farther into the future, there's greater uncertainty, there's greater risk. Okay? We have a pretty good idea of what we think is going to happen next month and the month after that. But you start talking about a year from now, 2 years from now, that's pretty far out there. Okay? This is much more common kind of pattern to see. That's why that kind of uncertainty about what's going to happen to the gross domestic product in the near term is so much more uncertain than what's going to be happening in the longer term is really a reflection of how COVID is working its way through. The prediction here is that inflation is going to be around 3.5% for the foreseeable future. The inflation rate has been about 2%, less than 2%. So this is kind of a bigger jump up for inflation than what we're used to, but this is not an alarming rate of inflation. Okay? This is a rate of inflation that maybe we can tolerate. Okay, so the economists are basically saying, or at least the economists in this Wall Street Journal survey are basically saying, yeah, inflation is going to go up, but it's not going to be rampant inflation. That can undermine the economy. Now, what's going to happen to interest rates? Okay, interest rates are predicted to be going up, and this is almost a guarantee. Why is this a guarantee? This one I'll bet money on. Because of inflation. Okay, the Federal Reserve has come out and has said that this rate of inflation, we can't handle this rate of inflation. We've got to tamp it down. And how does the Federal Reserve Bank do that? They do that by upping interest rates. They've already come out and said that they're going to ease their monetary policy in terms of federal deficit. You ever hear the phrase, the government is printing money? The Federal Reserve Bank has said it's been printing money for the last 2 years. And the way that they do that is that the federal government is running a deficit. And they pay for that deficit by incurring debt. And they incur debt by floating bonds and selling notes and selling bonds. Okay? The Federal Reserve has been going out and buying up those bonds. And how do they do that? They're printing money. Okay? The Federal Reserve, and by them going out and buying up all this federal debt, right, they're essentially keeping downward pressure on interest rates because they're buying that debt. Okay? They've come out and said, you know, we did that because of COVID, we did that because of the economy, we did that to help finance the stimulus policies that were put in place. We're going to start backing off doing that. That means the Federal Reserve, or the federal government has to go out and sell their debt to you and me, to China, to Saudi Arabia. And what are they going to do to attract those investors? They have to up the interest rates a little bit. Okay, so by the Federal Reserve not going and buying that debt, It's going to cause the interest rates the federal government offers on their bonds to go up. Okay? That means that the cost of the deficit is going to go up. It also means that the people that are going to own those government bonds are going to be probably a lot of foreign governments. Okay? So we're going to see interest rates going up. The other thing that they do is the Wall Street Journal, they ask, what's the likelihood of a recession in the next 12 months? And this is what all of the folks that responded to the survey with that particular question, this is what they said. The average was about less than 20%. 1 in 5 probability that we're going to go into a recession in the next year. Okay? One person said there's a 1% probability. One person way down there is very pessimistic and says there's a 75% probability we're going to go into a recession. Okay? That wide gap there between 1 and 75, that's why that confidence interval on those short terms are so high. There's a lot of disagreement amongst economists as to what the future of the economy looks like because we don't know what's happening with COVID. Okay? But the general consensus is we're not going to go into a recession. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with the economy that would drive a recession. Okay, the housing market, yeah, there's some concern. Are we going into another bubble? Perhaps. But what drove the Great Recession wasn't so much the housing bubble popping. That was the trigger. What caused the Great Recession was the financial markets. There was kind of a Wild West mentality in the financial markets during the Great Recession. It was those financial markets that collapsed that really drove the Great Recession. Okay? And it was the housing market that triggered it. We put in place now rules and regulations that are kind of preventing that Wild West mentality in the financial markets that drove the Great Recession from reoccurring. Okay? So even if we have a housing bubble, the likelihood of it triggering another major recession is probably pretty low because of the rules and regulations that we put in place. So, what's causing the jump in inflation is supply chain issues, okay? There are bottlenecks and there are bubbles. The difference here, we're all hearing about problems with the supply chain, and that's what's driving prices up, okay? That's why the producer price index jumped so much, is because of problems with the supply chain. Okay? The bubbles in the supply chain are essentially when we went into the initial COVID lockdown, a lot of companies shut down. Okay? It's very easy to shut down a company. It's not so easy to get it back up and running again. And we're finding that out. Okay? And as those companies try to get back up and start running again, it takes time. Those are creating those bubbles in the supply chain. And it's taking longer to get those bubbles out of the system than we thought it would. Okay? For example, my wife and I decided we want to buy some new furniture for our TV room. And we went in and it's like, my God, look at the prices. And you want that set? You can't get it until next August. You know, why? Well, the producers have got everything except they don't have the springs. Because the springs are coming out of China and they're locked up in a boat someplace. They got everything else except for that one thing. That one piece of making furniture is causing the entire furniture industry to go into lockdown almost, okay, because of one product. Okay, bottlenecks, on the other hand, is where you have the inputs are there, but they're trying to get through the supply, they're trying to get through. How many of you heard the stories about what's happening outside of the LA docks, Long Beach docks? Right? There's just, that's a bottleneck, okay? And why is there a bottleneck there? Well, they say it's because they don't have the truck drivers. The truck drivers say, no, that's not the problem. The problem is the warehousing. We don't have adequate warehousing. We can get it out of the docks, we get it off the ships, but we don't have the warehouses to put them in to get them off of the dock. That's creating a bottleneck. Okay? Those things have to work their way through. Labor shortage. Matt's going to talk a lot more about this. Retirement. The baby boomers are finally retiring in droves. Okay. Child care. Women's labor force participation rates dipped down a little bit because of child care concerns. Rethinking employment options. Back to that slide that in terms of employment coming back from COVID, is that high and middle wage jobs are doing fine. Low wage jobs, they're not coming back. They're not coming back because people are rethinking that, is that what they want to do? Okay, Matt's going to talk about that a lot more than I am. Pressure to slow inflation. Okay, we're going to see increases in the interest rates. Now, is this partially what's driving the housing market? Maybe. How many people are thinking, I got to buy the house now because interest rates are going to go up? Might be some stuff like that going on. Okay, will COVID ever go away? Okay, until COVID is kind of suppressed, we're still going to be kind of in a roller coaster type economy. Okay, because COVID is the wild card, and we don't know what's going on with it. Okay, how much time do I have left? I lost track of time. 10 minutes? Oh, okay, good. Something a little bit different. Economic development strategies and how we think about the future, or how states and local economies, governments, communities go about thinking about economic development, okay? We have a long tradition in the US to try to influence businesses' decisions to benefit us, okay? New Jersey, 1791 was offering Alexander Hamilton tax incentives to locate a manufacturing plant there, okay? The Erie Canal was built basically as an economic development strategy. Okay? 1884, the state of Pennsylvania was aggressively trying to place people, residents, leaders of Pennsylvania on the board of directors of different businesses and offer incentives to get businesses to build and expand in Pennsylvania. We have a rich tradition in the US of trying to influence how businesses, where businesses conduct business, okay? Now, I want to kind of look at the current, starting in 1930 and all the way up to today, and how we've gone about different ways of thinking about this. The first wave, which started back in the 1930s, is industrial recruitment. We need to get a business to move into town. That's industrial. That's been around for decades, that way of thinking. Okay? Unfortunately, a lot of people think that that's still the way to go about economic development, is try to get a business to move into town. Okay? We kind of then moved on to a second wave of thinking about it in terms of small business development. Maybe we need to start thinking about the businesses that are already in our backyard. Maybe we need to start thinking about business startups. Maybe that's where we should be focusing our energy. The third wave is public-private partnerships. This is essentially the public sector and the private sector trying to form organizations and institutions to help facilitate better communication, better networking. Chambers of commerce might be an example of that, okay? MADREP, the Madison area regional, what are they called now? Regional Economic Partnership. Thank you, okay? It's an idea, or it's a group that's trying to get the various economic development actors and various businesses together to talk about the regional economy. Okay, I think we're entering the fourth wave, which is commonly referred to as placemaking. Okay, we want to try to make our community as best attractive place for people to live. And I'll explain why I think this, okay? Let's go back to the first wave, industrial recruitment. This can be traced back to the Mississippi Balancing Agriculture Industrial Act of 1933. Mississippi basically kind of started this program and essentially said, hey, northern businesses in the northern states, right? Why do you think about picking up and moving from the northern states down to Mississippi? And why should you do that? Well, we have a better business climate than those northern states. And what makes it better? We have cheap labor, we have cheap land, we have limited regulations, and we have limited taxes. That's how they define a positive business climate, okay? The logic here is that if you business, northern business, pick up and move to Mississippi, your costs of operation are gonna go down. Okay, if your costs of operations go down, that means your profits go up, okay? This defines the modern way of thinking about a positive business climate. How many people, when you think of a business climate, when you think of the Wisconsin business climate, that's the kind of stuff you start thinking about, okay? If that's the case, you're kind of going back to the Great Depression in terms of your logic, okay? Time magazine actually referred to this as the new war between the states, okay? We're still doing it today. Foxconn. We threw a lot of money at Foxconn to convince them to locate in Wisconsin. How'd that work for us? Okay? Amazon, when they announced that they were building a new world headquarters, Headquarters 2, they actually put on a 13-page proposal which basically outlined what were they looking for in their incentives packages. Okay? Billions of dollars being thrown out there. I don't have time, but the classic case is Alabama and South Carolina going after Mercedes-Benz plant. I don't have time, but there's some great stories behind that one. How Alabama just got carried away. They were so obsessed with getting the Mercedes plant that they really just started getting kind of bizarre in terms of what they were putting on the table. Okay? The second wave, small business development, focus on existing businesses. Starting with the work of David Birch, he started to notice that, you know, the common thought in the 1960s and 1970s is that the engine of economic growth is the Fortune 500 companies. What's good for General Motors is good for America. Okay? So the big companies got all the attention. Okay, hey, big company, think about locating here, and we'll give you tax incentives. Okay? And by the way, we got cheap labor. And regulations, we don't have any regulations. Okay? Birch found that, wait a minute, these big companies aren't the engines of economic growth. It's the small businesses. This is job creation. This is national level. This is net job creation. Job creation can come from two places: existing businesses or new business formation. Okay? New business formation is the blue line, and you can see that on average there's about 5 million jobs created by new businesses opening. Existing businesses is the red line. The problem with existing businesses can do one of three things. They can add jobs, they can stay exactly the same size as they are, or they can shed jobs. Okay, so when we look at existing businesses, we want to take the number of jobs that are being created and subtract off the number of jobs that are being lost and look at the net. The net is the red line. Notice that throughout the entire time period, except for 1 year, 1978 and 1984, existing businesses have always shedded more jobs than they've added. Birch was the one that started looking at this and said, wait a minute, what we really want to do is not look at the Fortune 500, we want to look at entrepreneurship. We want to look at those businesses that are in our backyard, and we want to look at business startups and entrepreneurship because that's the engine of economic growth. Okay? The third wave is public-private partnerships. A lot of this has to do with Michael Porter and how Michael Porter introduced this notion of clusters, economic clusters. And particularly the Economic Development Administration, I need to be careful here, I'm picking on them because we get funding from them. But EDA basically said, Michael Porter's got it, okay? What we want to do is we want to focus on economic clusters. Those industries that are in a particular area that have shown some kind of comparative advantage, okay? For example, in Wisconsin, what's a natural economic cluster in Wisconsin? Healthcare. That's kind of a lot of places. The dairy industry, food processing, paper. Is paper a growth industry or a declining industry in Wisconsin? Okay. But you think about what are the traditional businesses of Wisconsin, and maybe those are the economic clusters that we want to focus on. Okay? Emerging clusters. The key here is networking these businesses. This is where Chamber of Commerce, for example, could come into play. A Chamber of Commerce can be very effective in terms of getting local businesses together to talk about the issues that they're struggling with. The Chamber of Commerce can come together and perhaps go to the village city leadership and say, hey, this is what our membership is concerned about. MadRep can bring in technical assistance and help local economic development groups kind of think things through, okay? So MadRep can help facilitate not just local, but kind of across multiple communities, okay? And find out, what's the city of Stoughton dealing with, okay? What's the city of Waunakee dealing with? How can we learn from these other places? Okay, that was a big motivation here. Notions of social capital come to the forefront. I could spend all day talking about that. Okay, the fourth wave. I think that there's been a fundamental shift in the economy. Okay, and I think that fundamental shift comes around, do jobs follow people, or do people follow jobs? Okay. Historically, people have followed jobs. You create employment opportunities, people move in and take advantage of those employment opportunities. Okay? If that's the case, then it makes sense to focus on businesses. Okay? I think we've gone through a shift. I think today, increasingly, jobs follow people. Okay? So if this is the case now, then we want to focus on people. Okay? Focus on attracting people to live in your community and then make business opportunities, and then business opportunities start to develop. Okay? So we want to try to make this a good place to live. Okay? The light bulb for me came from a study that I did with a colleague, John Halstead, where we were surveying small manufacturers, less than 100 employees, in rural areas in Wisconsin, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont. It was an old paper survey back before the internet was around, before Al Gore started the internet. I got a few Snickers out of that one, okay? We were interested in trying to better understand the role of infrastructure, things like highways, railroads, things like that. And what we were finding really was the quality of life mattered. And one respondent wrote this in the margin of the paper survey, and this was a real eye-opener for me. And this was back in 1997. Find an area that you want to live and then start your business. Okay, this, like a light bulb went off. This is jobs follow people. Okay, if this is becoming more important, then what we want to do is we want to focus on good schools, not to feed the labor market, to be attractive to families with children. Why would people want to move here? People with young children, why would they want to move to Sauk Prairie? Because you got a really good school system here. Okay? Public safety, do I feel safe walking my dog at midnight? Okay? Come home late from work, I got to walk the dog, I walk around my neighborhood, I feel perfectly safe. Okay? Parks, recreation, libraries, quality of life. Community fairs, festivals, art in the park, farmers markets, music on the square, viable local business organizations, including, see, now this is where it's not either or, it's both and. But it's the emphasis. We still want to worry about businesses, right? Because we're still worried about employment and income opportunities. But we're kind of shifting the emphasis on people, and then people that create businesses. Okay, we want them to move here, and then once they're here, how can we help you create business opportunities? Things like public free Wi-Fi, active volunteer organizations, early childhood education, creative networking opportunities for small business owners and those interested in starting a small business. That one is kind of coming out of that third wave of where, it's the phrase, it's not what you know, it's who you know. For entrepreneurship, that is extremely important, okay? Be open and receptive to newcomers to the community, okay? This is really important. It goes back to kind of social capital. I'm almost done. Back to this notion of social capital. Social capital is really kind of composed of two parts. Bonding social capital and bridging social capital. Bonding is kind of internal looking, okay? For example, you belong to a church or a religious organization, that bonding that pulls people together within that group, okay? Bridging social, so it's very internal looking. Bridging social capital is those connections outside, okay? For example, stay with the religious analogy. Is there a council of ministers, okay? Is the local rabbi and imam and priest and minister, do they get together like once a month and have lunch or breakfast or whatever to talk about the issues affecting their community, okay? Looking outside, okay? New people that come to town and want to get involved, are they actively involved? Are they engaged? My brother-in-law and sister-in-law moved to a small town in Illinois, central Illinois, and it's where they were born and raised. He was a Navy officer and retired, and they moved back to this small town. He wanted to get involved in local government. So he went in, and we've had lots of conversations, and he said, our community is close enough to Peoria that we're really kind of a bedroom community to Peoria. We need to embrace that and focus on why people should want to live here, okay? And then good things will happen. And they looked at him like he was growing horns out of his head. Okay? They were not receptive to new ideas coming in from outsiders. That town, that's the kiss of death. Okay? So those newcomers that come to town and want to get involved, extremely important. Okay? So, does one wave replace the next? No, it just simply expands our toolkit and kind of shifts our emphasis a little bit. Do we want to abandon industrial recruitment? Is it a good use of your economic development team to spend their days in Chicago trying to convince a company to move to Sauk Prairie? Is that a good use of their time? No, it's not. Now, if somebody from Chicago comes up and knocks on the door and says, hey, we're thinking of expanding and we're thinking about expanding into your area. Oh, let's talk. Okay, so be prepared, but that's not your primary strategy. Okay? I'll stop with that, and I think I hit time right. Questions, or do you want to have Matt, and then we can just kind of open it up for discussion? Quick questions, or just let Matt get going? Question.
In the supply chain issue, what would you gauge the time frame for that to start to go back to normal, whatever you decide normal is?
I think
25% through that process?
the supply chain problems, how long before we kind of work those things out? I think if we're still talking about this next year, we got a problem. It should work its way out. I would think that it's kind of, I'm surprised it's taken this long, but we've never shut the economy down like this before. And we have to go back to, the flu of, 1918. And the economy was so fundamentally different then, and we were in the middle of World War I. So we've never experienced anything like this before. So I would think that if we're a year from now, if we're still talking about it, we got a problem. Question, Matt, you want to go ahead?
Are
Yes.
My question is that you did not reference how national and state politics affect these numbers.
Where's the door? Where's the door? Bridging and bonding social capital. All the research is suggesting that bridging capital is the most important thing. Receptive to new ideas. Being able to work with your competitors, okay? Viable economic clusters, essentially, what makes a viable economic cluster is businesses that are part of that industry that are willing to work together. Not collude, that's illegal, okay? So go to jail for that. But it's that willingness to kind of work together, we've lost that. Okay, that ability to work across the aisle, we've lost that. So from a theoretical perspective, that's bad, okay? The ability of compromise is lost, okay? The ability of the Republican leadership and the Democratic leadership sitting down and saying, okay, we both agree that something's broken and needs to be addressed. What can we agree on? And let's focus on that. That's gone. And that's really, really not good. Because it basically means that some of the fundamental issues that we need to deal with are not being dealt with. Now, a colleague of mine basically said, maybe this is good because the government gets out of the way through inertia. Maybe, I don't agree with them on that, but it's a different perspective. So I think that this is, it's not good for the country, it's not good for the economy. And I'm not going to say who's right. You're not going to get me to say that one. Matt is a colleague of mine. Matt is he says he's a geographer, but I actually call him an economist. He's a really good economist that happens to think spatially. But he's an economic development specialist in the Community Development Institute. And we both work with the Economic Development Administration University Center. And whenever I'm finding my GIS and I can't get GIS to work, I call Matt.
Thanks, Steve. Can you hear me okay? Great. Good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you this morning and talk a little bit about what I see in terms of our current and future workforce. And I'm going to start with kind of a 50,000-foot level, looking at some trends we're seeing in the state of Wisconsin and how those have kind of evolved over the last several decades. And then I'm going to zoom in more so on the Sauk Prairie region and talk about some of the opportunities and challenges I see forthcoming for your labor force and what it might mean for you in terms of workforce and economic development strategies. So let's start with, again, looking at kind of the big picture. This looks at monthly job openings for the entire state of Wisconsin going back to the turn of the century. And one of the things you'll notice is that as the economy improves, the number of job openings grows, not surprisingly, and as the economy declines, the number of job openings goes down. And you'll see the drop in the number of job openings for the Great Recession, and then you'll see kind of the steady trend in overall growth in job openings. Now, more recently, we've seen this really big spike. And again, this has to go back to a lot of the issues that Steve was talking about with the pandemic. And we do see that we are pretty much near record highs in terms of number of job openings. But again, I want to emphasize that this is part of a longer trend that we've seen over time since the recovery from the Great Recession. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard stories in the media about that large number of job openings, and it means that people don't want to work, extended unemployment benefits and enhanced unemployment benefits cause people to sit on the sidelines, lack of work ethic, and I'm not here trying to say that none of those things exist. Undoubtedly, we do see some changes in terms of labor participation among certain groups. People did stay on unemployment longer in some instances due to enhanced benefits. But one of the things we're seeing is a structural change in our labor force due to how our population is aging. Now let's think about unemployment rates before we kind of go down that rabbit hole a little bit. These are January 1990 unemployment rates going up to the most current data we have in November of 2021. One of the things you'll notice is that for the most part, the state of Wisconsin's unemployment rate is below the national average. There's only a few periods where our unemployment rate exceeded that of the nation. You'll also notice now, in November of 2021, we are at 3% unemployment rate, which ties the lowest unemployment rates we've seen over the last 3 decades. So again, if we think about people perhaps sitting on the sidelines, it's not necessarily showing up in this data set. Another way to look at this is the number of unemployed individuals per job opening. And again, going back to the turn of the century for the most part, you'll see that as the Great Recession came on, there were a large number of unemployed individuals per job opening, close to 7 in some instances. It took a long time for the job market to recover in the state of Wisconsin, and you'll see it came down to the point in 2017, 2018, and part of 2019 where there was less than 1 unemployed individual per job opening, a very tight labor market. And again, this is pre-pandemic. You'll see the big spike due to the pandemic, but we are now at 0.5 unemployed individuals for every job opening. That means there's 2 job openings in the state of Wisconsin for every unemployed individual. And again, to me, that says there's not necessarily a lot of people sitting on the sidelines. If you think about a full employment maybe being 2%, 3%, 4%, economists will debate what full employment is. We're there, folks, and we've been there for quite some time before the pandemic and now after the pandemic. This is the number of monthly quits, so people voluntarily leaving a job for one reason or another. And again, you'll see that the number of quits increases as the economy improves, and you see the number of quits increasing throughout the recovery from the Great Recession. But again, you'll see we're close to an all-time high. And this gets back to some of the issues that Steve talked about in terms of people perhaps wanting a new opportunity, perhaps people having to leave the workforce because of childcare demands or other reasons. Now, people look at this, and it certainly creates pressure for employers, no doubt about it. But in some ways, in the long run, this could actually be a good thing for our economy. If people are, in fact, finding jobs that they like, that improves their earning potential over their careers, creates a career path for them, and enhances their productivity, in the long run, while it's painful now, it could be a good thing for the state going forward. Now, one of the things that we've seen in terms of labor availability and what we have to think about going forward is the participation rates. So unemployment rates do not include people that have dropped out of the labor force for one reason or another. They may have dropped out because they're discouraged. They may have dropped out because they're going to school. They may have dropped out because they're retiring. And one of the things you'll notice is that if we look at participation rates for the entire population age 16 and over, the state of Wisconsin has been above the national average for the most part. We're typically in the top 10 states in the country in terms of overall participation rates. You also see strong growth in overall participation rates throughout the 1970s and 1980s and into the early 1990s. What was happening then? Any ideas? What's that?
Baby boomers having kids?
Well, that's part of it. Women entering the labor force is a big part of that. You'll also see that the baby boomers were entering their prime working age years over this period. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. You also see it coming down since really the turn of the century. You see it come down from almost 75% in the late 1990s, and we're about 66.5% now. Again, still above the national average. But I think when a lot of people look at this trend, again, it goes back to this idea that people are dropping out of the labor force because they don't want to work or many other reasons. And again, that may be part of it in some instances, but there's a bigger structural trend that's affecting these drops in unemployment rates, or participation rates, excuse me. If we look at how participation rates have changed more recently due to the pandemic, You can see that for age groups across the board, age 16 to 19, age 20 to 24, 25 to 54, and those 65 and older. We certainly saw some dips at the onset of the pandemic, and that kind of goes back to some of the data that we just talked about before with Steve, as well as some of the data I just showed. You'll see in some instances it's kind of gotten back to where it was pre-pandemic level, especially with ages 16 to 19, but prime working age individuals, 25 to 54, individuals 20 to 24, still below pre-pandemic levels. The one that's really important here that we'll talk more about here in a second is the drop in participation rate for individuals age 65 and older. You can see that many folks took early retirement or maybe left the labor force temporarily until things improved, but you'll see almost a 3 percentage point drop in participation rates for individuals age 65 and older. Now, when we think about that overall drop in participation rate for the state of Wisconsin, we can decompose it into two different factors. We can think about how rates have changed among individuals of a certain age group. We can also think about how our overall age structure has changed over this period as well. So let's focus on that first part first, participation rates among different age groups. You'll see on your chart on the left, participation rates for individuals age 16 to 19, state of Wisconsin compared to the United States. On the right, individuals age 20 to 24. Again, you'll notice that the state of Wisconsin has a higher participation rate in these age groups than the national average. You'll also see that they've come down over time in both the state and the United States. Now, there's some good reasons for this. With individuals age 16 to 19, part of it is that if you go back to a longer period, dropout rates from high school have been declining. So it used to be if you dropped out of high school, you'd go get a good job somewhere, you were in the labor force. Now, if you're in high school still, or maybe starting college, you may not be in the labor force if you're in this age group. The other thing we see is that parents have put an emphasis on extracurricular activities as well as academics, and they don't want their kids working. So again, they've pushed them not to get a job in some instances, which has pushed participation rates down. Nonetheless, you'll see that the state of Wisconsin is quite a bit higher than the national average. Age 20 to 24, you'll see that the participation rate for those individuals is quite a bit higher than younger folks. You'll see also it's come down over time. Part of the reason for that, at least earlier on, not so much recently, was people going to college at higher rates and enrolling in post-secondary educational opportunities. Now there's a higher concern with individuals in this age group, particularly men within this age group, with participation rates going down quite dramatically for those individuals. And there's a whole host of reasons behind that we can talk about later, but it is one area that I think is of concern to a lot of labor force economists. Age 25 to 54. This is when people are most likely to be in the labor force. So they're probably out of college, they might be starting a family, they're not old enough to be thinking about retirement quite yet. And again, you'll see that very high participation rates for both men and women compared to the national average. You'll see that men has come down a little bit over time at about 91% now compared to 94% back in 2000. Women's kind of bounced around a little bit. It actually, you'll see that women participation rates tend to go up in some instances when men go down. A lot of this has to do with changing industry employment and cyclical industries, especially industries that are influenced by recessionary periods. But again, higher than the national average. Two more to talk about. Age 55 to 64. You'll see that participation rates there are still fairly high, but they're lower than individuals age 20 to 24, and they're quite a bit lower than individuals age 25 to 54. Again, state higher than the United States. One of the things there that you've seen is that participation rates have actually gone up over time. Now, there's some reasons behind that. Part of it had to do with the Great Recession. If you were close to retirement, perhaps, you stayed working longer because your retirement funds took a hit. But it's also may be that people just want to work longer than they used to. They want to be engaged. They want to be involved. They like their job, so they're going to keep working longer than they had to in the past. Some of that is also due to health, improving health over time. Participation rates for individuals 65 and older, you can see that they drop dramatically. about 20% in the United States and the state of Wisconsin. In the year 2020, we saw that previous chart before, that's probably actually maybe coming down a bit if state of Wisconsin's following national trends. You also see that they've gone up slightly over time as well. So that's the kind of change in rates. How has our population changed though? What happens when your population age 55 to 64 jumps by almost 80% over a 2-decade period, and you consider the participation rates of that age group before? What happens when your individuals age 65 and older jumps almost 40% over a 2-decade period? What also happens when your prime working age population, because many of them are aging into these older age groups, actually declines? What's that going to do to overall participation rate? It's going to push it down. And one of the things that you can do to kind of look at how the influence of population change and the influence of participation rates influences overall change is to do something called a shift share analysis, which Steve is probably rolling his eyes at right now. But if you decompose the influences of these two different factors, the vast majority of change in our overall labor participation rate is due to our aging population. Very little of it has to do with individual rate changes among age groups. So we can look at this in a little more detail in terms of the state. This is working age population from 15 up to 65 and older, going back to the 2000 census, 2010 census, and 2020 estimates. We do not have age distribution data from the 2020 census quite yet, but we do have estimates from the Census Bureau. Again, if you look at the numbers between 2010 and 2020, you'll see that the prime working age population of individuals 25 to 54 dropped by almost 200,000. You can see that the number of people aged 55 to 64 increased by over 100,000. And the number of people age 65 and older increased by almost 300,000. So we are growing older as a state, and that's not unlike what we're seeing in many other states, as well as many other industrialized nations as well. One thing to keep note is that age group 55 to 64 in 2020, how it's increased over time. What's going to happen as we go forward 10 years from now? Age 65 and older is going to continue to increase in the next decade. Another way to think about this is, what if we just take the prime working age population of the state of Wisconsin, individuals aged 25 to 54, and let's look at how they've changed over time in terms of their actual participation rate. If we look at how their participation rates changed over time, it has declined somewhat. But even with that actual participation rate, the number of prime working age individuals has dropped dramatically in the state of Wisconsin. So if we said to ourselves, hey, let's go back to the year 2000, where participation rates were about 3 percentage points higher for this age group, and push it back up to then, how would that influence the number of workers in this age group? Well, it would bump it up about 37,000, and that's not bad. But considering there's 100,000 job openings right now, and considering that the distribution of these individuals varies across the state, it's going to have an impact, but it's probably not going to be the dramatic impact that most people think. Okay, so that's kind of the 10,000 foot view, or 50,000 foot view, I guess, in this instance. Let's kind of step back a little bit and focus more on the Sauk Prairie region, and maybe from a 10,000 foot view perspective. And when we think about the labor force, it's really easy to focus about people that live in our communities, and they are an important part of our labor force. But when you look at commuting patterns, in most communities, a very large share of workers that work in that community come from somewhere else, and a very large share of people that live in that community work somewhere else. So these are pre-pandemic numbers, but they're the most current we have. This looks at the table on your left, people that are working in Sauk Prairie, the two communities. Where do they live? You can see that combined, only about 22% of the people that work in Sauk Prairie, maybe 23%, also live in Sauk Prairie. What that also means is that about 3/4 of your labor force comes from somewhere else. Now, that could be a neighboring community, but it could also be the city of Madison, which provides 270 workers, and so on down the line. We can also look at people residing in Sauk Prairie. Where do they work? Well, again, a notable share do work in Sauk City or work in Prairie du Sac, but they work in Middleton, they work in Madison, they work in Baraboo, they work in Wanakee, and so on down the line. So anytime you're thinking about your labor force, I would encourage you not just to focus on your community itself, but focus on the broader region where these individuals come from. Just a perspective on the county level data. We can see that if we look at people that work in Sauk Prairie, about half of them come from Sauk County, but that also means half of them come from somewhere else. If we look at people that reside in Sauk County, where do they work? Again, a very notable share work outside the community. And this is part of a big regional network of commuting flows. This looks at commuting networks for non-metro counties, of which Sauk County is one. This is the outflow of workers from any county to, from where they live to where they work. You can see that these are very intricate, dense networks of people traveling from their place of residence to their place of employment in many non-metro areas. The other thing that we've seen over time is that the share of people that commute outside their county of residence has grown in almost every instance in the state of Wisconsin. That map on the left is the share of individuals that commute to another county for employment back in the second quarter of 2002. If we step forward to the second quarter of 2018, we can see that the red hues have increased dramatically in some instances. One final thing to keep in mind is the share of individuals that may be commuting long distances, and this is some work that we've been toying around with a little bit recently and trying to look at it in a little more detail. These are what's known as stretch commuters, people that commute more than 50 miles each way from their place of residence to their place of employment. Now you'll see in 2002 that there certainly were some pockets, especially in rural areas and around the fringes of metropolitan areas, that had fairly high shares of workers commuting long distances. This is 2018. Very dramatic shifts in some places of people commuting very long distances. And they're doing this for a variety of reasons. Quality of job, cost of housing. It may be that they're close to retirement, and during the Great Recession they may have lost their job, but they do not want to move to where a job was, so they're willing to trade a commute for staying in their current home. They may not be able to sell their home because they were upside down on it in terms of their mortgage value after the Great Recession. Now let's think about unemployment rates more locally. This goes back to November 2019, so before the start of the pandemic, up to the most recent data we have for November of 2021. Before the start of the pandemic, it kind of mimics what we saw in that previous chart for the state of Wisconsin. Very low unemployment rates for the most part, with the exception of Adams County. Probably full employment for most places before the pandemic. What's happened since the pandemic? We are now even below where we were before in unemployment rates in every single county, or every single geography here with the exception of the United States. Look at places like Iowa County, Dane County, 1.4, 1.5% unemployment. That's insane. Here in Sauk County, we're at 2%. Again, very low unemployment rates. So most people that want a job probably have a job. These are participation rates more locally by age group. And again, these are prior to the pandemic, so we got to take them with a little bit of a grain of salt. But nonetheless, what you'll see is that Sauk County, for every age group, is higher than the national average. You'll also see that those participation rates kind of mimic what we saw before on the chart for the state of Wisconsin. Somewhat higher rates for 16 to 19, fairly high rates 20 to 24 and 25 to 54, and then coming down as people age into older age groups, and at 19.2% for individuals age 65 and older. Now, let's kind of take what we did for the state of Wisconsin and localize it in terms of how the population has changed by these different age groups over time. In this instance, we're going back to 1970 and looking at the total working age population age 15 to 64 by census decade. You can see that in Columbia and Sauk counties, we saw fairly steady growth in terms of the working age population throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and up to 2010. But since 2010, it has dropped. Prime working age individuals, individuals aged 25 to 54, same time periods. Strong growth throughout the 1970s, 80s, 90s, plateaued a bit towards the year 2010, and now has declined. And you're not unlike many other counties in the state of Wisconsin. If we look at counties that have actually increased their total working age population from the 2010 census up to the 2020 estimates, there's only 8 counties in the state of Wisconsin that have actually grown their working age population. Those are the counties you see there in orange on the map. There's only 2 counties that have grown in total prime working age population, Eau Claire and Dane. So in some ways, that's perhaps an asset for you because of your proximity to Dane County and a growing working age and prime working age population. An opportunity to perhaps recruit employees into Sauk Prairie businesses. Now the flip side of that is the number of individuals aged 65 and older. We can see that in Columbia and Sauk, the 2 lines on top, pretty similar growth trajectories. But really, since 2010, the numbers have increased dramatically. And again, this has to do with the baby boomers reaching typical retirement age. And as I mentioned before, this is not expected to stop. If we look at the number of individuals aged 55 to 64, or individuals that will be age 65 and older in the next decade, we can see that they've gone up dramatically. So that share of individuals aged 65 and older will continue to grow. And these are projections from the State Department of Administration. Admittedly, they're getting a little long in the tooth. I wish they would update them. I'm sure they will once the new census numbers comes out. But what it shows is the share of population age 65 and older, going back to 2010, up through 2030 projections. Again, you'll see that Sauk County is projected to go from 15% in the year 2010 up to almost 23% by the year 2030. And again, this is not something that's unique to Sauk County. This is something that's happening across the state of Wisconsin, something that's happening across the upper Midwest and across many rural areas, non-metro areas across the state or across the United States. The map you see there on your left is the share of population age 65 and older in the 2010 census. At that point, there were only 2 counties in the state of Wisconsin that had a quarter of their population age 65 and older. By the year 2015, we see that increase to 6, and if we step forward over time, we can see how it changes dramatically. So what does that mean for you? Some of the workforce trends that we saw before in terms of declining overall participation rates, declining working age population are probably going to continue unless something changes. But how also does this affect your community? What other ways does it impact your community besides just workforce broadly? Any ideas? Housing, for sure. And maybe not just the cost of housing, but perhaps the types of housing that are needed in a community. It may not be 3,000 square foot homes on 2-acre lots. It may be very different for individuals as they get into retirement age. What else? What about things like healthcare? Does healthcare go up or down? Demand. It's going to go up. Transportation. Revenue for schools, for basic services. All these things are going to change as our population ages. If we also think about individuals age 55 and older, so continuing forward, we can think about how they influence different industries in the Sauk Prairie region. If we look at the share of individuals age 55 or older by different industry sectors, we can see that some are very high, over a quarter of their workforce age 55 or older, or perhaps approaching retirement in the next decade or so. Retail trade, educational services, manufacturing, utilities, all have very high shares of individuals within this age group. If we look at the total number of individuals age 65 or age 55 or older by industry sector, healthcare, number 1. We just talked about how healthcare might increase in terms of its total demand, but it's also facing a large number of individuals that may be retiring. Educational services, manufacturing. Manufacturers have had a hard time finding employees for some time now, and now think about the number of people that may be leaving the workforce over the next decade. For the sake of time, I am going to skip over this. But it kind of gets us back to the issue at hand, and Steve talked about it in terms of economic development strategies and how they've changed. How can we think about strategies to build our workforce and address some of these issues that we're facing going forward? So talent attraction and retention, Steve talked about placemaking. How do you build a community that people are going to want to move to or stay in? Assisting in the development of career pathways. Retraining, you looked at all those quits we saw before, and Steve talked a lot about this a little bit before as well. How do you help people that may have quit a job for one reason or another move into a different career path by getting them the skills they need to get them on that career trajectory going forward? Internships and apprenticeships are hugely successful in many places. How do you engage the youth early on to get them into your business and keep them there? Individuals for opportunities with barriers to employment. Childcare. If you don't have a car to travel to one place or another for their job. People that may have a justice system involvement in their background. Then all these other things that we can think about in terms of how we can attract and retain workers in our community. And again, I'll emphasize the fact that I believe that this has to be a regional effort that brings a lot of stakeholders together. These public-private partnerships that Steve talked about just a second ago. So community colleges, the K-12 system, universities, employers themselves, social service agencies. All these people have to be working together to help solve this issue for communities. Again, it's just not one group at the table. It's not just one community at the table. It's a regional, deep network of stakeholders. So let's talk a little bit about talent attraction and retention as a way to kind of kick off some ideas. These are percent change in population for Sauk County and surrounding counties. I'm not going to go into this because Steve talked a bit about it, but one of the things we do see is that growth rates have slowed over time. Just other perspective on neighboring counties. And one of the things you'll see is that if we look at percent population change by decade for Sauk County versus Wisconsin versus the United States, you can see that between 2010 and 2020, all three of these areas had the lowest population growth rates they've had since the 1970s. So slow growth in Sauk County, slow growth in the state of Wisconsin, slow growth in the United States. If we look at the patterns across the United States, this looks at the percent change in population by county, 2000 to 2010. We see patterns of strong growth throughout southern states, throughout many western states, as well as the areas around large metropolitan areas. So you see the Twin Cities, you see the outskirts of Chicago, you see places like Nashville, the metro areas in Texas, and so on and so forth. And if we step forward to 2010 to 2020, we can see that in most places, these rates have gone down. So again, it's not just something that's happening here, it's happening in many places across the United States. Overall, we do see some of the similar patterns that we saw before in terms of growth in southern states, as well as growth around large metropolitan areas. But even in some instances there, it has slowed down. So what this means is that it's not just an issue that you're dealing with. There are many places that are trying to understand how are they going to find the workers of the future. Which also means, I hate to use the word competition, but in some ways you are in competition with a lot of these communities in terms of finding the workers that they need. Okay, so we can decompose this rate of change a little bit into two different factors. We can look at what's called natural increase, or births minus deaths. If you have more people being born than are dying, you have positive natural increase. More people dying than being born, you have negative natural increase. We can see that if we look at the changes in natural increase from the prior decade to this decade, with the exception of Vernon County, it has dropped everywhere. Anyone know what's going on in Vernon County? There's a large Amish population. You'll even see in places like Dane County, it's come down quite a bit. In Adams County, it's actually negative. In Juneau County, it's negative. Richland County, it's negative. More people dying than being born. But again, this is part of a bigger national trend we're seeing. Birth rates are at a 7-decade low. People simply are not having the number of kids they had before, and that is influencing population growth. We can also look at it in terms of net migration, people moving from one place to another. If you have more people moving in than moving out, you have positive net migration. More people moving out than moving in, you have negative net migration. With a couple exceptions, you'll see that net migration actually slowed as well over the same period. The exception being Dane County, where it actually increased a little bit. But look at Sauk. It went from 8% down to 1.5%. A very large drop in terms of people moving here on a net basis. And again, these drops are part of a bigger trend we're seeing across the United States over time. This looks at the share of people moving of different types, people moving within the same county, people moving to a different county in the same state, moving across state lines, or moving abroad. And you can see that for decades, this overall trajectory has been down. If we look at people just moving across county lines or across state lines, we can see that it has dropped as well. And in fact, if you look at the overall mobility rate, we are at the lowest we've been since essentially World War II. Now, there's good reasons for this, and I think these reasons have to inform some of the things you think about in terms of workforce development and economic development strategies. Some of it's demographics. As people get older, they tend to move less on a rate basis, so that's part of it, but it doesn't fully explain everything. One of the things to think about, and it goes back to Steve's point about quality of life, is that it used to be to excel in certain occupations, to find a job or get a good wage, you had to move to certain places. So if you were a computer programmer back in the early 1980s, you probably had to go to Dallas, Boston, Seattle, or the Bay Area. That was it. Now there are jobs for computer programmers everywhere. So for someone to have to move to one of those places, it has to benefit them in many other ways than just a good paying job. They have to take all these other counts into balances. Net benefit to changing employers has decreased as well. Now this probably may have changed a little bit with the impacts of the pandemic. People are changing jobs all the time because it benefits them. But over time, the benefit had decreased, a bit. It used to be that if you wanted to move somewhere to find out about it, you probably had to visit there. You had to perhaps move there and just take a risk. But now you can go online and find out almost anything you want to find out about an employer or a community, good or bad. What that also means is that your online presence for your community is going to be available to everyone that's making this choice as well. There's also this idea of what is called stickiness of place or secular rootedness. People in a lot of ways want to be close for one reason or another to their family members, to their friends, to places where they grew up, to places where they had attachment from vacations and things like that. This has grown somewhat over time. People simply do not want to be removed from many of the things that they experienced in their youth. So what's this mean for Sauk Prairie and the state of Wisconsin? For a long time, people have kind of bemoaned the fact that Wisconsin is losing residents due to migration, net migration. So these look at net migration rates going back to 1990 up to 2019. You'll see that if you're above the line, it's 0, you have positive net migration. If you're below the line, you have negative net migration. State of Wisconsin's kind of bounced around that 0 line. Positive net migration in some years, negative net migration in others. I'll also highlight Illinois, Minnesota, Colorado, and Washington. Minnesota's been pretty close to the state of Wisconsin in most years. Illinois has seen people lose most years. Colorado and Washington have been above that line and significantly above that line many, many years. Okay, let's dig into this a little bit more. These are in-migration rates. So one of the things you'll notice is that, all right, people are moving to Colorado and Washington, makes sense. They're moving there in large numbers on a rate basis. Makes sense that Wisconsin and Minnesota would be a bit lower based on what we saw before, and quite a bit lower than places like Colorado and Washington. But these are people moving out of the state of Wisconsin and out of Minnesota and out of Illinois. You'll see our out-migration rates are very low as well. You'll also see the out-migration rates for Colorado and Washington are actually higher than ours. How can that possibly be? It's due to the fact that their in-migration rates are so much higher than their out-migration rates, they're able to offset those losses. And what we see is that these places are dynamic, is that they have a lot of churn. People moving in and out of those states on a regular basis. So they're dynamic. There's a lot of turnover going on there. But on a net basis, they're actually increasing their population due to migration. Wisconsin has a very low churn rate, which also gets back to one of the points that Steve made earlier, is that if we're thinking about people when they do come to our community, and given the fact that almost everyone that's in Wisconsin is from Wisconsin originally, were born here or moved and came back, a very high share of our population has done so, that also means that we may not think about newcomers in the same way that a place like Colorado or Washington or other places might. So how do we treat those individuals when they do come here from a different place? Not to keep going on this, but just to look at individuals with a college degree, very similar trends, negative net migration rate overall. Out-migration rate is one of the lowest in the entire country, but our in-migration rate is even lower. So we think about talent attraction and retention. We're seeing mobility rates go down. Wisconsin typically has not done a really good job on attracting people on a net basis, on a large number. So talent attraction and retention will be part of our strategy. But we also have to think about other strategies that will help us engage the individuals that are already here. And one of those is childcare. These are participation rates for males and females aged 20 to 64. One of the things you'll notice almost across the board is that female participation rates are lower than males, and traditionally a lot of this had to do with childcare obligations. We can also see this is some work, based on some work that our colleague Tessa Conroy has done. If you look at the participation rate for females versus the number of children under age 5 per prime working age female, as the number of kids goes up, participation rates go down. For men, it's the exact opposite. As participation rates go up, or as the number of kids per prime age male go up, participation rates for males also go up. What happens though is once kids reach school age, is that you actually see participation rates for females with children between the ages of 6 to 17 actually higher than they are for the overall population of working age females. And again, this goes back to the importance of childcare for many young families of getting people into the labor force. But it's also not just the importance of getting people into the labor force. If you look at a lot of the research on the outcomes for children in the long run for the labor force that went to early childcare, early childhood education, it improves their productivity. It increases their participation rates. So there are factors to keep in mind beyond just getting people into the labor force. Now with the pandemic, we found that some of the problems in terms of childcare availability and childcare cost have been exacerbated, but a lot of those problems were there before the pandemic. So as a community, as a business, as a region, how do we think about opportunities to make childcare available and affordable? A couple of last topics that I'll touch on here. Things like automation. Now, automation, I think, is frightful for a lot of people. People are thinking that robots and computers and other things are here to take our jobs. And the reality is that automation historically has not resulted in net job losses. It's actually resulted in net job increases over time. We're still not making buggy whips anymore. Those jobs are gone, but we are increasing overall employment growth. A couple things to keep in mind is that investments in automation tend to accelerate after an economic downturn. We've seen this over time. When people and companies come out of a recession, they tend to invest in measures that improve productivity through automation. But what that does is it doesn't necessarily, again, influence job replacement, but it influences the types of skills that people need to complement automation going forward. Now, if we look at some measures of probability of computerization by different jobs, different occupations, this is one estimate. This looks forward to, say, about 10 to 15 years. What this says is that about 29% of jobs in the state of Wisconsin have a 90% higher or more probability of being automated in some way going forward. So automation is going to be a big part of our workforce development strategies going forward, and in some instances it's probably going to be necessary. Again, we've talked about companies being lured from one place to another for one reason or another. If we don't have the labor here and somewhere else does, and we can invest in automation to help keep that company here, that's a win-win. If we look at occupation categories that are the largest in the state of Wisconsin, the probability of them being computerized, we see a number of them that have a very high probability of computerization or complementation going forward. A lot of them are in retail, a lot of them are in services, a lot of them are in construction, a lot of them are in manufacturing. What we do see is that they tend to be lower wage. And again, people leaving their jobs in the pandemic and the loss in lower wage jobs, in some ways this will influence some of the things we're talking about in terms of automation as well. If we look at industries with a 75%, if we look at employment in industries for those occupations that have a 75% greater ability of computerization, things like agriculture have a very high propensity for automation. People think, well, how are we going to do this in agriculture? Robotic milking, self-driven tractors. There's already a lot of technologies that are coming online. Retail trade over 60%, manufacturing over 50%. So again, automation in some ways is going to change our workforce, but it's also going to, I think, help alleviate some of the workforce pressures we're seeing. The last thing I'll talk about is broadband, and Steve mentioned the importance of broadband in terms of talent attraction and retention, in terms of what it means for the economy, in terms of growth, but it's also important for workforce development. If we think about broadband in a post-COVID economy, we think about how people are learning new skills. A lot of them are now being learned virtually or digitally, which requires broadband. Remote working. If you do want to try to attract people or encourage people to work remotely, we don't have the broadband, we mentioned this before, it's a non-starter. And again, talent attraction and retention. If you're trying to attract a family with kids and their kids can't go on TikTok or whatever the flavor of the day for social media is, it's a non-starter. So when we think about lack of access, a lot of times we think about the infrastructure. We simply don't have the infrastructure available, and that may be true in many places. We also have to think about things like affordability. Even if we have the infrastructure, is it affordable for our residents? In some instances, it's not. We've seen a lot of that in many places due to the pandemic. And then adoption rates. Just because it's here, does people mean that are people actually using it? And in some instances, they may not know all the things that broadband may offer them in terms of a resident or in terms of a business owner. And one of the things we've tried to do is dig into some of these issues a little bit more. We've tried to map out access to broadband using the 25-3 measure that Steve mentioned before. But one of the problems with this data set from the Federal Communications Commission is that, frankly, it's not very good. The way that the FCC states that a census block is being served by a provider is that only one household in that entire census block has to be served by a provider. That means there may be many other census blocks or many other households or businesses in that census block that are not being served, but it's being reported as served. That said, we do know where there are census blocks without any access to broadband. You can see those mapped on the map on your right, and you do see them in many places throughout Sauk County, as well as in places around Sauk Prairie. We can also think about affordability. This looks at the share of households with a broadband internet subscription for 2 different household income ranges, for those under $75,000 a year, for those versus $75,000 or more per year. You'll notice a trend there, that if you have money, you're much more likely to have a broadband internet subscription. If you don't, you're less likely. So one of the things we try to do is to look at census-tract households that have a broadband subscription, as well as those that have a high income and do not have a broadband subscription, as a way of also looking at where places may have gaps in affordability or infrastructure. And again, throughout Sauk County, you do see some places that do not have high rates of broadband subscription, as well as individuals of higher incomes. I'm going to skip over that, it's a little complicated for a long presentation. If you are interested in some additional ways to think about broadband options for your community, if it's an issue that you are dealing with, I'm sure many of you are. Shameless plug, we did put out a series of reports about a year or so ago looking at broadband in the Wisconsin economy, as well as strategy and policy options for broadband access in Wisconsin. Those are available on our website, and do provide a number of case studies and examples and strategies that communities can help engage in to bring broadband infrastructure, affordability, and adoption in their communities. With that, I'm going to leave it there. And do we have any questions?
A while back, you showed a slide about net migration.
Yes.
In Sauk Prairie, in our area. To what extent is the availability of housing factored into?
So if you didn't hear that, the question is, if we look at the slide showing the changes in net in-migration for Sauk County, how much does housing availability or affordability influence that? And that's kind of hard to parse out. And I guess I would say it's one of those factors where it's necessary, but not sufficient. So you certainly have to have the housing available to get people here, but there may be other factors at play as well beyond just housing.
Do you have an example of a community that has a very successful plan for the affordable housing issue?
Boy, that's a great question. And I know there are many communities that are working on this across the United States. I guess one that I would perhaps point to, just because I've been somewhat close to it, is that Wanakee just finished a housing study that looked at many different aspects of their housing stock, affordability, and other factors that are influencing housing construction. So that might be one to start with.
We're in the process of trying to put together a, Matt shared with you the broadband report that we did. We're working on a similar report now on housing issues, and we're in the process of collecting a series of case studies of different communities. And Reedsburg actually has an example for older folks. I don't want to say, well, retirees, I guess you could say older folks. That's going to be included. It's a complicated issue because a lot of housing has to do with the character of a community, and it can be a very contentious issue. Wanakee was really struggling. I was part of that process that a colleague of ours, Kristen Runge, went through. And half of the community kind of was of the philosophy that if you work in Wanakee, you should be able to live in Wanakee. So that meant, a whole spectrum of. Then you had the other half of the community that were basically, look, my primary asset is my home, and I don't want anything going on that's going to affect the value of my house. So it can get very contentious very quickly. So I wish that there was, the other thing is that what works in one community may not work in another community. So it's, I wish we had an easy answer for you. This is part of the problem, is that a lot of times we look at this stuff and we kind of say, okay, well, here's an issue you got to worry about. Here's an issue you got to worry about. Here's an issue you got to worry about. And they're not standalone. They're all kind of interconnected. And this is where a lot of times it's, you know, we kind of say, you need to look at this overall picture. What makes this a good place to live? Why would businesses want to start here? And then you start identifying how all these different things are interconnected. But you kind of pick off one thing and say, we're going to focus our energy on this right now. And then we're going to shift over and start looking at other things. And realizing that they are all interconnected. Some communities may decide that, you know, hey, we're going to focus on childcare. That's what we're going to focus our energy on. Another community may say, no, we're going to focus on broadband. And that's where we're going to put our energy. With the realization that over the long term, we're going to be looking at a lot of these different issues. I think that's one of the things that really kind of places communities at a comparative advantage over, say, the state or the federal government in terms of doing community economic development. Local residents are very much in this, you know, how can we make this a better place for our kids and our grandkids? They're taking a long-term view. Whereas a lot of folks, in maybe back to the political question, is in, you know, state government and federal government, particularly federal government, is they're looking at their next election cycle. They're looking very short term. They want it now. That's why things like Foxconn was such a hit, because it's flashy, it's shiny, it's right now. It will help me get reelected in the next election cycle. So at the state level and at the federal level, kind of the discount rate is extremely high. What that means is they want it now. Whereas at the community level, we're thinking, you know, we're trying to make investments now that may not have a payoff for 10 or 20 or 50, 20 years. And that's okay. Okay? That really makes it a much more viable, kind of sustainable approach to work at this at the local level.
Any other questions?
Ben, could you put that bubble chart you had about automation? Could you put that back up?
This one?
That one, that one. That one really is a wow factor to me, because you look at the higher income, and I'm looking at this through the lens of kind of income distribution, you know, the rich getting richer, the poor staying poor and getting poorer. When I look at this, I kind of see, you know, folks that are in the higher income levels, that have education, that have higher levels of training, they're going to do fine. They're going to come out fine. The folks that struggle, the folks that had a hard time getting through high school, that don't have the training, that don't have kind of the critical thinking skills and whatnot, they're in these occupations, lower income occupations, that are more likely to be automated. So what this says to me is that there's a group of folks in the community that are really at risk here down the road. And we're seeing this in kind of this widening of the income gap, kind of the hollowing out of the middle. Okay, kind of the low income still being there, and then the high income getting higher. Okay, and that makes me nervous.
Dr. Dallin, isn't that what you're talking about, though, with the low income jobs that are available? I mean, if you don't automate, that's where they are.
Are we in a unique situation right now because the unemployment rate is so low? There's 2 job openings per every unemployed person. Right now, workers are in the driver's seat. The workers that are in these lower can basically say, I don't want to work that anymore. I want to start moving into these higher income jobs. Good for them.
So
But that's short term. That's right now.
right now.
This is long term. Okay? Does this tight labor market continue to give workers kind of the upper hand? I don't know if that's a long-term situation or if that's a short-term situation, but this is a long term.
And I think here too, in the short run, if those jobs cannot be filled because of the tight labor market, maybe business owners are saying, I have no other choice but to invest in automation to fill those positions.
You look at dairy automation, automatic milking machines. When those things first came online, everybody thought, oh yeah, geez, George Jetson and Star Trek, right? That ain't gonna happen. Increasingly, more and more dairies are moving towards robotic milking technology. One, because the costs are coming down. People are becoming more comfortable with the technology because they're seeing it. They're seeing their neighbors using it. And secondly, they can't find the workers. So is it a choice because it's a profit maximizing strategy that they're being pulled into it? Or are they being pushed into it because they can't find the workers?
And we also didn't talk about immigration and the impact of
And that comes up every single time I give a presentation like this. And it's a conversation I think we're going to have. And what happens, I think, locally when you talk to a community is that so often it's pushed to the federal level. You know, it's a federal issue. There's nothing we can do to influence it. But you're all citizens that elect people that go to the federal government and influence these decisions. So I would argue that there are some things that you could do if that's an important issue for you.
The federal reps, they're not going to listen to Matt and me. They don't listen to us. They listen to you.
And with that, I know that Dr. Deller and Matt both will listen to you as long as you have questions. So we do want to be respectful of your time and let you get on with your day. But let's give a round of applause to both Dr. Deller and Matt. I want to leave you just with a couple of thoughts. Oh no, okay, well you remember all those bubbles. All those bubbles you see at the bottom, those are our service workers right now in this community, those earning under $20 an hour that have no housing here. They don't have access to rentals and they don't have access to affordable housing. And so the chamber has worked with Dr. Deller and a team of folks over the last year and a half. We've finished now, and we kept running into brick walls. Together, we have to find solutions. On the child care issue, I just want you to leave with numbers. We have a group, because we couldn't find solutions around our housing need immediately. We said, well, what else stresses that monthly household budget? Child care was right there with the annual house or the monthly housing cost. We worked with our local child care providers, both center and in-home, as well as representatives from WESN. We identified 500 children under the age of 5 that we have a gap in this community. That means your employees, in many cases, are getting up in the morning, driving to Wanakee, Baraboo, Middleton to drop their child off, coming back to your workplace, being worried about what's happening the distance, getting off at the end of the day, driving back to get their child. So if they can find a job around the corner from their child care place, doesn't that make sense? We have to address that gap in service. So thank you again. I hope I leave you asking more questions. The chamber is working on this. We'd love to have your voice. Thank you to the Bank of Prairie du Sac, Steve, Roxy, and Lauren Olson, who puts all of this together. And thank you to Nick Dingman with River Arts. And I especially want to thank Mark Fry back here, who generously always takes a day off, comes to volunteer his time to film, but he's live streaming this today as well. So thank you so much for attending.